Hello everyone and welcome to the 2023 landscape submission evaluation. So we opened this up to landscapes and cityscapes owing to the fact that not everybody lives where landscapes are readily available. So let's jump right in and take a look at this. You guys across the board had pretty consistently good results, or submissions I should say, for this category, and I was pretty darn pleased seeing the work that you submitted. We're going to start here with this photo of a train yard from Gemista, and yeah, this is a very pleasing composition and structure. So we talked about in architecture last time, having the person to show scale. So we've got that. That does give a really good sense of scale. We know that either this is an incredibly good model, which it's not, or this is a real train yard with a vintage train that's probably being used for either it's like a museum or a display piece or something along those lines. And we have a little bit of indication of the wind moving because of the train smoke. But really what this is, this image is pretty well dominated. If you look at this photo, it's kind of like in three layers. We've got the foreground of these different train lines, and then we've got the midground of the train and the buildings, and then the distant background of the horizon and the clouds. And so it sets up this really deep and visually interesting structure because there's a lot of depth. And then there's also a lot of different motion and different movement going on with the way that the lines are moving through the image differently. And also just the general structure of the train being seen from the side here, again, gives us a really good sense of the shape and the age of the locomotive and the Pullmans that are behind it. So overall, a really good photo in all of those regards, as well as from an exposure perspective, where the shadows have good detail, the highlights have good detail, and all of that really worked out very well for a photo like this, which was taken in full sun. You can tell by the shadows and pretty harsh lighting. Next up, we're going to go to this photo from Richard Mengle. And again, another photo very much in the vein of classic landscape photo structure. We have something close up at the front. We have a mid-ground subject of the lake, and then a distant image, the distance of the far tree lines and the sky. Really good use of color here. You can tell it was taken during autumn, right as the leaves were starting to change. And there's just a nice mix of colors across the entire spectrum, with the reds, the yellows, the greens, the blues, and just everything really working out very nicely like that. So I'm really pleased with the structure of this photo, and I think that there's a lot that's working really well here. If we were going to look at what could we potentially envision as another approach to this, if you think about going back to the same spot in the fall again, if you can, take your tripod and do a long exposure, so you get a little bit more. I mean, the water there is very smooth, but you get just a hint more, and then some motion in the clouds, or do a simulated long exposure. Realistically, that would be about the only way I can think of to revise this photo to make parts of the scene maybe just a little bit more dynamic, to have some cloud motion in there. So other than that, in terms of landscapes, really structured very much like a classic and traditional landscape would be structured. This photo comes from Richard Mander, and is a picture of a bench overlooking farmland, or a rural area at least, and good, pleasing composition with this one right here. The things that just right off the bat that I'll notice, the horizon line a little bit crooked, but that's if you think back to when we talked about the geometry of the lake in the action photo video, when you have a horizon which is going away at an angle from the photo, and then that three-dimensional space becomes two-dimensional. That line, which is a flat angling away, when it's converted to two-dimensional, becomes a downward or upward angle, and generally, I think should always be downward. Yeah, it would be. Anyway, becomes a downward angle, and that's what's going to make the horizon line look like it's a little bit askew. So generally speaking, when you have a horizon like that, if you correct the photo for that horizon, then even if the subjects in the photo are just a little bit off, it won't be as noticeable because of the horizon. But back to the things that are really working here. We know what the subject is. It's a good use of depth of field because the subject is what's in focus. And then behind this relatively dark bench, we have this field of color. Like everything around this bench is green and blue with a little bit of like the browns and the gold tones in the fields. And so all of those colors really work together very well to set the bench apart, because aside from the light shining off of the seat portion, which is a little bit brown, the rest of the bench is dark to black. And so the field of color around the bench does a really nice job of setting off the shape of the bench, which is also a very pleasing shape as well. So good eye for a good scene. Next up from Stephen Boyce, we have, I think, unique among the entries this time around. This looks like this photo was taken on a glass plate. So, well, if you look around the perimeters of this was probably a glass plate. I guess it could theoretically have been a Polaroid, but I don't think so, because the difference in tone is due to the difference in the thickness of the emulsion. So in the majority of the image where you have good tonal range, the emulsion's a bit thicker. Around the edges where the emulsion, when it's poured onto the glass, has surface tension in it, it goes to the edge of the glass, like a drop of water has a bead around it. The same exact thing is at play here. And so the emulsion becomes thinner toward the edge of the glass. And what that does is allow more of the silver halide crystals to be exposed, so it becomes darker on the negative, which translates into lighter on the positive, except in places where the emulsion didn't actually get onto the glass, like in the bottom right corner there. There's a little probably air bubble or something, and that's where there was no emulsion on the glass and the light just came through, which translates, that clear area on the glass translates into a dark area on the positive. So that's why you're seeing what's going on with the perimeter there. Good for a glass plate photo, especially. I think a subject like this really works well because glass plates have tons and tons of potential for detail. They're large, generally sheet film size, and the grain on them is tiny because these things, the fast ones are 25 ISO. The slow ones are 1 to 2 ISO. And so really fine grain particles on there so they can record a lot of detail. And that's why, even though if we, I can zoom in, I don't. So that's why, even though like some of the details are a little bit soft, almost, I kind of feel like this looks like looks like a photo that was taken with one of my pinhole cameras. It has that character to it, but there is still a lot of detail, even though there's softness in the image, like the individual tree branches in the forest in the background are visible there. So couple of things. If you imagine going back to try this again, if you lift up the tripod higher and you get the tree in the sidewalk closer to the bottom of the glass plate, then you'll get more of the top of the tree, and you'll lose some of that foreground of grass, which isn't contributing anything to the overall image. And then the other thing is, with glass plates, paper negatives, anything like that, they can be a little bit finicky with the chemistry. So in some of the shadow areas around the center of the tree, for instance, there are some chemical residue drips. So when I develop glass plates at home, I'll have another tray, and it's just for distilled water. And then that's the last thing the glass plates go into. After they're done being fixed and rinsed, they'll go, and I've rinsed them really well, I'll put them then again in distilled water only a few times before that distilled water's done. And then that distilled water will take any residual chemicals and remove them from the glass plates before they go up to dry. So just an idea on that. But otherwise, if we assume that this was a pinhole camera, notoriously hard to frame up, and the framing job of that would have worked pretty well. Our next photo comes from Steve Easley, and we have a photo of the sunset. I'm trying to think if I have no idea where that would be. But what we have with this, like many sunset photos, we have very vibrant colors, blues, oranges, yellows, and all that really nice complementary colors that work well together. Then we have a good reflection on the water, and then the silhouette of the old structure in the water as well as the rocky shoreline. So really pleasing use of that, and also the and a really interesting cloud structure in the image as well. So the clouds have multiple layers to them and lots of depth. There are different tones and different illumination levels within the clouds as well. And so that's a really interesting element of the photo. If there were a couple of things that could be redone, so if you take your camera back out here with a tripod, one of the things is the horizon line. Same exact thing as has happened with many people, is that it's at a little bit crooked because it's receding away from the camera. The horizon on the left side of the image is much closer than the horizon on the right side of the image, and so that causes that slight downward angle. Also looks like this was a pretty wide angle lens given the slight curve to the horizon line, which is looking like some mild pincushion distortion in the lens. And then the other thing is, if you have the tripod, you could do either a long exposure or a long exposure simulation with a bunch of photos, stacking them in post and then averaging the colors, and that, or the layers rather, and that would give you some cloud motion in the sky, which in a sky like this would be very dramatic, because it wouldn't just be cloud motion, you would have cloud and color motion as well, sort of all blending together to make these streaks of different colors in the sky, which I think would be absolutely stunning. And then also the water, the ripples in it would smoothen out really nicely, and you'd end up with this really lovely, smooth blur in the ocean of the sun and the clouds as well. So just a way to think about restructuring that. One thing just in general with landscape photos, if, you know, anytime, and I do this too, like if you've seen enough landscapes from me on this channel to know that a lot of times I'll show them with cloud motion in them, but not always. But the ones that come at the fronts of my lens review videos, for instance, that have landscape photos, those always have cloud motion in them because it creates a more visually interesting image, if done right, if the motion isn't too great, than does static clouds. So just a thing to think about when you're out seeing a scene like this. Our next landscape photo comes from Stephen Boesky, and kind of hard to gauge at first if this is more of a landscape or an action photo, because it does freeze the action of the seagulls. So I would lean more to this fulfilling the prompt for the action category than the landscape category. So, but some of the things that are really going well here, I do like the use of depth of field in this a lot, because the birds are in focus, but the waves behind them start to get out of focus, and then the ocean and then the bridge way in the background out of focus, and then the foreground water is out of focus as well. I think the overall structure of having minimal foreground, just a little bit of water to show that it's there, and then having the birds filling up that block that is most of the middle half is working out really well, and then having the sky open as well, giving the birds someplace to fly, is a good instinct for how to structure this photo as well. Next up from Wayne, we have the photo of the tree growing up and into the power lines. Never something that tree maintainers want to see when they go out to take care of a tree. So something that's really working very well here is the use of tonal range across the photo. There are a few highlights, like really bright highlights, and then there are a few really dark shadows, but the majority of this photo is hanging out in the middle tonal ranges, including the sky, and like even the shadow under the car, you can make out a bit of the gutter as well, even like underneath it, and you can make out some of the details about what's the car where the grill is missing. So from a technical execution perspective, especially given that this is a film photo, This is not an easy exposure to get and shows a really good eye for exposure, as well as a really good approach to developing, because this negative being developed incorrectly could really quickly lead to the shadows being completely clipped, the highlights being completely blown out, and things like that. And then added to that, the detail in this scene from the front, where the lines in the pavement are, to the distant background, it's all sharp. So that's really good work as well to get all of that depth of field into this photo. Our next photo comes from Yunus Bicer, and this is a photo of it's looking like the UK. That's my best guess. But boats along a canal somewhere. Probably looks like some houseboats, I would guess. And this is a really good example of how converging lines can work as part of an image structural element, because we have the central bridge, which is its own unique shape. Because I mean, the boats have curves, but the bridge is the only thing with an arch built into it. And so all of the boats on both sides are pointing toward that. And then so they're guiding the viewer's eyes toward that bridge, which is the key element. But then also we have the trees, and the tree line is going down toward that bridge on the right side. And a little bit on the left as well, though it's a little bit more broken up, is going toward that. And then the sky is reflecting in the water, and both the sky and that reflection are pointing toward it. So this right here is a really good example of how leading lines don't actually have to be like straight lines. They can be elements of the scene, and they can work really well to guide the viewer into some key part of the scene. Next up, from Francesco Coppola, we have, well, look. When I first saw this, I thought, do I need to ask Francesco if he sent the wrong photo? And then it occurred to me, no, he's not going for this category. He's going for the portfolio win by sending 5 photos of attractive women for his portfolio submission, and he knew he could not get into the portfolio if he didn't have all 5 photos. It's a bold strategy, Cotton, and we'll see how that works out for him. From Harrison Fisher, we have a landscape photo of an old wall going to looks like an old stone barn or ivy-covered barn and farmhouse, I would assume. This is a photo that's doing, like, I think Harrison also submitted the bridge photo from the last one, I think, if I remember correctly, that was like violently film, was how I described it. And this is another photo in that exact same vein. You've got some scratches on the negative, some places like in the trees shadows where you have some development flaws with all of those little white dots. They could either be the little white dots would be dust on the negative. Because it could also be dust on the sensor, but mostly those look like negative dust spots because they have the same focus as the anyway. So this is an example where the photo really does the nature of the photo does a really good job of backing up the overall image, right? This is an old place. It's got a lot of texture, a lot of character, and then the film adds to that. So I also, by the way, really like how the use of exposure here, because like I said in the previous a couple black photos ago with Wayne's photo, really good use of keeping everything in those middle zones without shadow or highlight clipping. This starts to embrace those end zones. So we have really dark shadows that have no information in them and some really bright blown out highlights in the sky as well. And I think I probably should have put this photo right next to Wayne's, because I think they show 2 different approaches to landscape photography with the same general medium of black and white film. One is to constrain the way that the film is going to deliver those tones, and this one is to let the film expand into those tones so that those tones can convey the image seen. And what I think that these show together is that there's no single right way to use film to create a photo. It's dependent upon the scene. So if there were a couple things I would look at trying to do if I had the opportunity to go to this photo, to go to this location again, one is that the horizon again is a little bit cockeyed, and you can see it in the telephone pole and in the verticals of the barn. Those both look like they are a little bit off. And if those were bolt upright, I think that the tree being a little bit slanted to the left wouldn't be an issue. But by the time you get to this building over on the right side that's kind of cut off, that really shows. And then the other thing is the little bow tie of hair or dust on the building's roof. That's the only place in this photo where I would say the negative flaw is distracting from the rest of the image. Our next photo comes from Alexa D. And we have a photo of what is either a hunting blind or a tree house in a foggy tree line next to a farm field. I'm really, this is one of those things that stood out to me, is that those trees are all like leaning. I mean, either that or the hunting blind is completely leaning. But I think it's really fascinating the way that all of those trees are leaning away in the same direction. Yeah, that's just kind of neat. Anyway, back to the photo itself. Landscapes in fog are really captivating to look at, and I think there's a couple others in this video that we'll see. And I really like the way that the fog has this straight line right above the plants on the left side, and the way that this photo does a really good job of capturing that, because the fog disperses and mutes the light coming in at dawn here. And where there is no fog, then we have a much clearer view of the scene, and that's in the lower third, we'll call it, of the frame. The overall use of color, really, really nice, because we have a lot of different muted tones here. And so I know there's a big instinct when taking photos of landscapes. Dial up the sliders, make all these colors really pop. And I think this is a really good example of how a photo doesn't have to have all of the landscape colors really popping for the photo to still be able to convey a sense of place and be a successful landscape image. From Andrej Bjelakovic, we have a cityscape and a nice long exposure of traffic moving at night. And this is a really interesting use of light and negative space. So we're right up front. I think the first thing that we're going to notice is all of the lights down at the bottom. The cones of light coming from the street lights, the lights in the building and the buildings in the background, the signs and the street lights way down in the distance, which are indicating that this was probably taken on Cinestill 800T because of the halation glow around them. And then, so just naturally, because all of that is so bright, our eyes are going to be drawn to that. It's almost really easy to forget that that's only half of the photo, and then the entire top half is just this dark gradient going into the night sky. And one of the things that's really neat about the way that that's done is it almost makes the night feel kind of oppressive in this setting, and really makes the city that's being photographed in the roadway feel like they're just being pushed down on by the night sky. And having the cityscape and the street here in the bottom half really complements that sense with the way that this photo is structured. And then in addition to all of that, we have some really good choice of which roads to use, because there are some interesting shapes here in what looks like a cloverleaf interchange on this highway, where you can see the triangle shapes that are mirroring each other on both sides of the road, and the way that the lights are tracing the motion of those, or the shapes of those roads. So you have the motion backing up the road shape. And I think this was a really good example of how all of those elements can come together really nicely. Our next photo comes from Avery Wagg, and this is a photo of an ice-covered river, maybe going into a lake with snow on the trees. I think this is the only winter photo in this year's entry, and really, winter photos can be really lovely. They are like, and I will say, I am not a master of getting winter photos. So I don't know that I have many. I don't know that I have any I would point at as saying I'm happy with that. But they're really nice when they work out. One of the challenges, of course, in a setting like this is the water stationary. So then it becomes like a picture of trees next to ice. Something that really I think is a good eye here and is working really well are the way that the snow highlights the branches of these trees. And this is a good use of photographic time. Like, what I mean by that is your time and when you go out to photograph things. If you imagine if Alexa had gone out and taken this photo, say 3 hours later, when it was 10 degrees warmer, would the snow still be on those trees? Probably not, or at least not the same way. So the selection of this time of day, which looks like it was probably fairly early in the day. There's a bit of an angled sunlight coming in from the side. The selection of this time of day is a really good instinct, because a lot of the time, the best photos we take are going to be taken in those early morning or late afternoon into evening hours. And the light in those settings is very dynamic and really captivating. So anyway, and also snow, a good use of medium for a photo of snow, because snow photos work really well in black and white, much more so than they do in color. So definitely a good eye in that regard as well. So a lot of things really working well here. If there were a way to look at this, it would be curious to ask, does snow come before the air gets cold enough that the water freezes? And if the answer to that is yes, now imagine how this river would look if you had a nice long exposure with the snow on the trees and some movement in the water at the same time. So I think this is a great location for a photo, and there's a lot of potential in this scene. Our next photo comes from Blue Moon Kiss Love, and is a landscape photo of a bunch of American flags in soil in front of, I would assume, a government building of some kind. My guess is that this is either a July 4th celebration or a monument to one of the war losses. Although I guess technically we haven't been at war anyway. So I'm gonna guess that this is probably a July 4th celebration. I think one of the, generally speaking, when we talk about having landscape photos, it's like, oh, deep depth of field. And this photo breaks that rule, because really only a handful of these flags are in sharp focus. The ones in the very front are blurry, and then they get progressively softer going back toward the building and the trees, which are definitely out of focus. And I think this is a way to say that landscape photos don't have to be in deep depth of focus from front to back. There are lots and lots of rules about the way that different types of photos should and should not be taken. And every one of the rules that exists, we can find many, many examples of photos that break that rule and do so well, and prove why the rules are not hard and fast rules, they're guidelines. So I think that this is a really good way of isolating just a small subject, those handful of sharp focus flags, and then also showing the scene that they're in with enough information that the sense of place and time and meaning still come through with the image as well. This is a photo that would not in any way, shape, or form benefit from being sharp from front to back. Our next photo comes from Brendan, and this is a photo taken, I'm going to guess this is either at the base of the footing of a bridge or I'm going to, yeah, probably, because I think it'd be kind of hard to walk on that slanted side there. But underneath, or at the edge of a bridge, looking out at the waterway of a city too old to be in the U.S. And really think this is a stunning use of black and white. So we've talked about in many of the other videos, some of the things that black and white does really well are lights and darks, contrast, tone, tonal range, and texture. So you can see right off the bat, the tonal range in this photo is pretty decent, going from dark darks up to bright brights. I would say kind of skewing toward the lower, the darker tones if you take the sky out of the equation. Okay, but then some of the other things that this does really well and for black and white photography are all of the different uses of texture. The water, it's not just smooth. It has texture in the water. Then we have the textures of the stones, some of which have different textures from the other ones. The wood skiff or rowboat in the very foreground. The repeated structures of the old buildings in the background. That wall in the far background. And then, of course, the sky is, we could say, functionally texture-free. And also, there's a lot of really neat use of shape here as well, because we've got the dark of the bridge, and the way that this photo is angled, even though I'm assuming that what we're seeing are the left side is one side of the arch of this bridge, and the dark side on the right is the other side of the arch of this bridge. And this photo would not work as well if you were further back, right? If you just got that whole arch, this photo wouldn't be as neat, because right now you have at the very top this framing structure, which reins in the photo subject with texture, light and darkness, and also these converging shapes, right? You have a lot of straight lines, and then these two curves that go up to meet each other. And there's just a lot of different dynamism with this photo going into the shapes, textures, tones, and things like that. And really this isn't a time where a good eye for photo composition came in, and this turned out really well. From Clay Williams, we have a stunning sunrise, looks probably like sunrise photo in, I'm assuming, a ski setting. And man, sunrise colors are absolutely wonderful, especially on a snowy mountaintop. So really good setting with a lot of potential here. A couple of distracting elements are, I'm not sure what this thing in the foreground is. It looks like it's not deep enough to be a swimming pool. Maybe it's a retention basin or something like that. And then the snow fencing around it kind of pull the viewer's eyes away from the sunset in the mountains. So a couple of things to think about with how things that are working. On the mountains, you've got the building and the ski lift posts, and you can see the ski lift chairs there as well in the middle. And then over on the right side, you've got a couple of people, 2 or 3 people over there, who are doing a thing, who knows, checking on instruments or whatever they're doing. And so they give a sense of scale, and then pair them up with the structures on the 2 mountains over there, and it gives you a sense of distance and depth. So if we imagine that this photo, if you could go back and take it over in that right corner where those people are, and get the people in the foreground of the photo, and then that would force the mountains to be a bigger portion of the photo, because right now they take up less of the photo space than does the thing that's in the foreground. And then if you have the people in the foreground, they would be much larger. And then the sense of distance to the mountains would be amplified. And then if there were a way to do a long enough exposure to get the clouds blurring so that they wouldn't be clouds lit up by sunrise, they'd be a color field of sunrise above these blue and pink mountains. I think that would be a really lovely way to turn the sky and the clouds from being sky and clouds into an element of the image which amplifies the sharpness and the relief of the mountains by becoming really blurry. So really good. This is a really good setting and a really good time of day. Definitely worth revisiting as well. Next up, from David Higgins, we have a really fantastic use of aspect ratio. So this is, I think, the only really, really wide photo that we have in any of the entries this year. And this does a really good job of using aspect ratio to complement the subject, because the subject is this sort of off-center, character-rich barn with a long horizontal fence and then a field underneath it. And that ultra-wide and short photo is emphasizing the shape of the fence and the hill going up to it. And because all of that is really wide, and then you have this sort of now comparatively squat barn, it emphasizes that barn as the subject of the photo. A couple of other things do as well. The color. The barn's the only thing that's really like bright red. You have some oranges off to the right side, and then the goldenrod color of the field or hill at the bottom. But the red and the rustiness in the roof of the barn, that's really what our eyes are being drawn to. Then there's a lot of really interesting texture here, and this is a photo that shows that texture need not be the exclusive playground of black and white photography. You can use color photos to get nice texture quality in your images. So if there were anything I think would be interesting to play around with this, it would be lifting the camera slightly, not all the way so that the fence is at the bottom of the photo, but if you imagine cutting the bottom third of that hill off, and then on the right side, those trees that are clipped wouldn't be as clipped, or might not be clipped at all. And then the shape of those trees going up to the top of the frame would do a really good job of sort of penning in the framing on the right side. And the other thing is, if you cropped in a little bit from the right to get rid of those green bushes, just see how that looks and if that works well as in addition, because right now all of the trees, right, they're either last stage of autumn leaves or the leaves have fallen, except those pesky green bushes. So anyway, just a couple of different things to think about. Overall, a really successful use of this image subject and the aspect ratio and the image, the way that this image is built. From Emma Bockelmann, we have a photo of some trees in a forest. And so it's definitely a film photo. And I'm trying to figure out, the colors are just like a little bit off. And I'm trying to figure out if it's expired film or home developed film. Because honestly, this is pretty close to the results that I got on my first dozen rolls of home developed film in terms of the digitization, casting the slide holder casting a shadow on the right side of the photos, and then that looking a little bit brighter in the positive, and then some of the colors digitizing from RAW is not an easy thing to do with C41 film. Anyway, all that aside, some of the things here that one of the things that jump out and tells, actually I can tell you right now, this is a home digitized photo. If you look in the top right corner, there's a little bit of the edge of the negative that shows through there, which tells us that this photo was a C41 negative that was digitized in a slide carrier. That and the brightness on the two sides, that's a hallmark of that. So Emma, real quickly, if you are digitizing these and using a RAW workflow, you might be able to correct that apparent exposure imbalance, because I'm sure it doesn't exist on the film, with your shadow and highlight sliders, and those tones on in the center and the sides should be recorded as shadow and highlight data. So if you dial back, actually it's a negative, so if you dial up the highlight and dial down the shadows, that might even out those exposure variances that are caused by the negative holder. So anyway, I think the way that the colors here have turned out not quite right is a really interesting use of color with a landscape, because as one of the things we've talked about throughout all the color photos is like the colors pop, they're on, they're correct and all of this stuff, and then this one we get to and it's not. And I think it's a good way to show that color data doesn't necessarily have to be spot on. It can be intentionally adjusted to create a different effect for the photo that makes it feel a little strange. And I think that's amplified by how crooked all of these trees are. That's clearly like how they're growing, looking at the foreground and things like that. But I think that the sense of this photo, it's sort of like a disorienting type of landscape because of all of the different factors that are working into it. And I think that the important thing to take away there is that landscapes need not be something that somebody would put onto a postcard or in a calendar. They can be something which sends a message about the scene, tells a story about the scene, whatever that story is, using different elements within the image of structure, color, things like that to do so. Our next landscape comes from Frank Wouters, and this is a photo of, I'm assuming, the Swiss Alps, because that definitely looks like the Matterhorn over on the left. I could be wrong about that. Taken from an airplane. So one of the things about airplane photography is that you are gonna get the wing. And in this case, one thing right off the bat, if you took the clone brush and took the text off of the wing here, that would reduce the amount of attention that part of the photo is getting, and that part of the photo is taking away a lot from the mountains. Because otherwise, or if you cropped this photo up and made it a slightly shorter photo and took out the text and maybe even all of that black line in the wing, I think that would make the wing less apparent as a wing, and it would become more of an image element that's binding the viewer's eyes to the mountain range, sort of doing the exact same job as the sky above, but as what would become generally a plain white field. Just something to experiment with there, because what the photo basically is of, it's a texture photo, and it's a color field and texture photo showing the smoothness of the wing, the smoothness of the sky, and the absolute jaggedness of the mountains in front, in the middle. And I'm not going to lie, those are stunningly gorgeous mountains. Holy cow. Wow. There are some mountains in there I think I would probably enjoy hiking. Sorry. Another thing to think about with this is what's the color doing for you here? Because your colors are functionally, they're blue and white. So if you had this this looks like a digital file. If you open it up in RAW and you started adjusting, first thing you did was desaturate it, or remove the vibrance, one of the two. I'm not sure which one it would be, depending on which software you use, and then start adjusting the tone, the darkness of the blue channel. Then most of what's in here is going to be cyan and blue channel. And if you adjust those sliders, not all the way down to the bottom, not all the way to the top, but in different increments to see how turning this into a black and white photo could emphasize the nature of the texture of the mountains when it's in opposition to the smoothness of the wing and the sky, I think that might be something worth playing around with to see how that texture, that textural difference becomes something that really drives the way that this image could work. Just something to think about and see if it works for you. Our next landscape comes from Jaeyon Lee, and this is a photo of a sandy path up to what I'm assuming is an ocean beach with a fishing line post at the bottom of it. Fishing line, or when Steinbeck goes to the beach, something else goes into those things sometimes. Anyway, sorry. Okay, so I think we have this photo basically is using the landscape to bind the subject. The subject, intentional or not, becomes this post at the end of the path. I'm not sure if that's what the subject's supposed to be, though. Is it supposed to be that? Or is it supposed to be the horizon line and then the path leading to the horizon line? And this is we talked about, I think, in the last video, that I have a personal bias against trash cans in photos, and something we'll revisit again in the portfolio video. And there's no good reason for that. I'm weird, but anyway. What we have here is basically a place for waste, and it becomes the subject of the photo. So it becomes a distracting element in the overall rest of the photo. So anyway, some things that are working here. I think that the idea of using this path as a way to guide the viewer's eyes to the scene is a really strong one. So if we play a little bit of what if, imagine that, let's see, if we could find a different path down to the ocean that didn't have something at the base of it, now we would have a photo which is functionally about shape, the shape of the grassy hedges or brambles on either side of the path, and then the hourglass form of the water coming down to the shoreline, and then sort of spreading out again as the path comes towards the base of the photo. The other thing to see if it's possible, and I don't know exactly where this was taken, but if you found a path maybe to the right of where you're standing right here, in the distant background of the ocean, you can see that there's something there. It looks like it might be a couple of islands or something like that. So imagine hypothetically you found a path that looks exactly like this, but instead of having the fishing line bin over there, the islands were in the middle of the horizon. So then it would become a landscape photo that guides the viewer's eyes up this path that they're standing on, walking up to look at the ocean, and in the distance those islands or whatever are back there. So I think the idea of the structure is working really well. It's just the location didn't do a ton of favors for the overall photo. Next up, from Joseph Schallmo, we have a photo of a bunch of the Acela trains sitting in probably New York. That looks like maybe. I'm going to guess it's probably, anyway, Acela's run from DC to New York. So it's somewhere along that corridor on the East Coast. And, oh yeah, Schuylkill Yards. That's New York. Anyway, so I think this is a kind of a neat photo because all of the trains and then the coal cars that are in the yard as well, they're all pointing in the same direction. And that's pointing us toward those tunnels, which I assume are going into the station or out of the station, one of the two. And then over on the right, we have a bridge with another freight train on it. And then over in the background, we have a couple of train bridges. And then beyond that, we have all the buildings. But when we look at just the train yard here, between the ones in the foreground, the trains in the foreground, the empty tracks there as well, these different bridges, there's this overlapping set of layers and lines, and they converge and cross and things like that. And it adds a lot of visual complexity to the image, but it's going to sound weird, but in a simple way. Now, if you think back to the very first photo we saw today with the other train yard, and the way that those lines kind of angled around on themselves, similar type of thing. Those created a visual complexity by having lines moving in different ways. And this is creating that visual complexity as well. Our eyes are short for nothing to look at in this photo. There's a lot going on here. The only questions then become, what is it that our eyes are being drawn to? And ultimately, our eyes are being drawn to a few of those trains in the middle, and then we're kind of following those trains toward that underground entryway. And so I think, so the question then becomes, is that what we want to have the focus of the photo be? And I don't know the answer to that. Maybe yes. But I think that the things that are working really well here with the complexity of the different layers and different line directions is a really good instinct and done very, very successfully. Our next photo comes from Joshua Gaude, and we have a photo of, I'm going to assume cypress trees, hard to say. And this is a photo that looks like it's using an intentionally soft lens. I'm going to hazard a guess that this is a medium format film photo, and probably done on an older lens. I couldn't tell you which one. There's some interesting looking at this from what type of lens is this, like playing that game. It's really fascinating to look at the grass in the very foreground, especially the corners, and the way that it's blurring. You can see a little bit of chroma taking over the blur shape there, and a little bit of astigmatism as well. Some of those points are becoming like sickle shaped. And then up in the right, you have a lot of light loss going into just a general softness. And the vignette that is in there, it's present, really kind of encapsulates this dead tree that's in the middle of it. So there's a really good use of the way that the lens performs to amplify the subject of this photo. If you imagine that this lens, let's say, was like hypothetically technically perfect, and that the blurry areas didn't have that characteristic coma astigmatism blur going on, but they were instead just generically soft. And if you didn't have that vignette that was around the corners, then it would be the subject wouldn't be as clearly defined as, you know, as standing alone in this field as it is right now due to the way that the lens performs. I think this is a really good eye for how your equipment can make or break photos sometimes. This is especially true if you're using equipment that's not technically perfect, because those technical imperfections, and if you've seen the lens reviews here, then you'll know that one of the things I often say is, just because your lens has flaws doesn't mean it can't create captivating images. Here we go. Just because the lens has a flaw doesn't mean it can't create a captivating image. So this is a really good way to look at a scene, to understand the equipment and the way that it performs, and say, this scene and this lens and this camera are going to work together and align to create something that's going to create a pleasing image. So the only thing that I would highlight in this image from a capture issue is that the trees in the distant background are in sharper focus than the trees in the foreground, which would probably indicate that I'm going to guess that if this is a 6x6, you're probably looking down at waist level, and that is a position which is inherently prone to shaking just a little bit when you take the photo. So I'm going to guess that this was likely handheld, and you may have wobbled just a little bit when the photo was taken. And the reason is because this lens clearly was shot wide open, or very nearly wide open, and so you wouldn't be likely to see focus shift, as the older lenses as they stop down can sometimes exhibit focus shift as the light rays on the periphery are blocked out, but that's not what this looks like. So I think all of the instincts here are lining up really well. It was just a matter of you know, exactly where the focus ended up being when you hit the shutter button. Our next one comes from Ken Andersson, and this is, hey, I recognize that thing. Just looking at this right now, I think I know where the photo Ken submitted in the last one was taken, because you can see that archway over on the left side. So I think I said that looked like an old mine setting, and this looks like an old mine building. Anyway, so from a landscape cityscape perspective, I think this is a really good use of black and white, and this is a good use of your medium as well. You can see the film grain here, and the grain that's apparent in the sky is doing a really good job of amplifying the setting, because that grain is carried into the road in front. It's carried into the rock pile, the texture of the concrete building as well, and really creates a unifying and really pleasing eye texture throughout the entire image. So the image construction itself is pretty decent. The road at the bottom is this big, bright, light-toned area, and it's effectively a funnel. It starts off really wide, taking up the whole base of the image, and then narrows down to this roadway, and then up and over. And so the eye naturally follows that bright area into the rest of the scene. And then the rest of the scene becomes this interesting thing that's penned in by the medium gray of the sky above and the clouds. And so that structure kind of forces the eye to stay within the scene. And another thing that really is doing that as well is, if you look on the right side, you have this hill slanting down toward the road. And on the left side, you have the base of this building, which has a structure slanting down to the road. And so that structure of the natural shape of the hill and the man-made shape of the building sort of mirror each other as well. And so there's a symmetry, a general symmetry in the way that this photo is structured. Yeah, overall successful photo would, would be good. Next up, from Milan Cetic, we have a really nice long nighttime exposure here, and we have a little bit of cloud motion, which is always a really nice thing to see in clouds in a landscape photo, or cityscape in this case. And then we have enough brightness from the scene, from the city, to illuminate those clouds, but the clouds also do a really good job of blocking that light, so you still have a lot of darkness from the night sky up at the very top. And so the darkness at the top and the darkness of the lights on the closer buildings down at the bottom make this image sort of, they pen it into the middle third of the frame. And one of the things that's going on there is that is also sort of the softest third of the frame. And you can tell that this is the lens was stopped way down. If you look over on the right side and the left side, you can see some of these source point lights. The stars are forming, and they're pretty well defined, which means this is at least f8, maybe a little bit smaller. And so that's how you get the long exposure. But I'm assuming because of the fog, all of that stuff in the middle distance from beyond this really dark hill in the foreground to the horizon is a little bit softer. So I'm curious as to what would this photo look like if the foreground hill had been in sharp focus? Because right now everything's just a hair soft, which I'm not sure if that's a little bit of motion blur or if it's diffraction softness. I honestly couldn't tell you. Maybe it looks a little bit more like diffraction softness. But anyway, imagine opening up the lens maybe a couple of stops and then getting this foreground hill in sharp focus, and then the sky with the cloud motion, and then the fog in the area beyond that hill is a little bit softer. I think that would really, pulling those buildings in the foreground and the lights and the shapes of them into sharp relief would have given that part of the photo a little bit more of a visual pop. So that said, otherwise, the general structure of this photo really working out very successfully. And I think this is a good eye for a good location for a nighttime photograph. It's definitely, if possible, worth revisiting. You know, one other thing that might be worth asking is, how would this look if you had a tighter lens? So let's assume that this is like a 28mm lens. It might be, it's hard to say for sure. But if it's in that range, imagine this with like a 135 pointed over at those tall buildings on the left. Cut out the smokestack. But if you framed this so that those tall buildings were a bigger part of the photo, how would that look? Because they're really an interesting element of this skyline in here, and might be worth seeing if there was a way to isolate them either from this position or somewhere else as part of a nighttime photo. Our last before the honorable mentions comes from Mukul, and this is a curious photo that I have struggled with a bit. At first it looks like an infrared photo, right? Because the grass is red. But then you have these clouds of rainbow colors, which makes it look like, actually, no, it's not an infrared photo. It's a multi-channel black and white photo with different filtration, multiple negatives, same scene, and the time of changing the negatives, changing the filters, allows the clouds to move through the scene, which gives them that rainbow effect because they end up being recorded in different parts of the film on different color channels. And when those three different black and white photos are combined and the channels are converted to the color data from black and white, that ends up creating that rainbow effect. And that could also, if you intentionally, I'm going to assume intentionally, put the layered color channel data to be incorrect for the different layers, would turn green grass to red. And so one thing, as we talked about earlier, this is a photo that shows how the use of color need not be true in a landscape photo to create a successful image. I think as a A use of color as an experimental photo, if my assumption about the way that it was created is correct, I think is really an interesting way to go about this assignment. The only distracting element in here really is the sign, which kind of feels like it's sort of the point of it, because now because it's a landscape, right? It feels like the point of the photo is to say, this is a landscape. Everyone should be able to appreciate it and enjoy it, but we're not allowed to go there, and that seems wrong, so all of the colors now amplify that by themselves being wrong. To that end, I think that's a really successful approach to this photo. It would have been interesting to see how this would have looked taken 5 steps to the right and up next to the sign there, or a little bit closer to it, and seeing how this would look as a more traditional type of landscape without the sign in the foreground. But otherwise, good use of color. If let me know, Mukul, if I'm right about how this photo was made, because if so, that's really good work. I can't do this well. I can't do anything close to this when I've tried that technique. And also, I think this is a really good way to structure a landscape photo that tells a story about the subject. So with that, we are now going into our 3 honorable mentions. And our first honorable mention comes from Casey Schmidt. And this is a photo of a ray of some light rays coming in through rocks. So I think this is a stunning and lovely use of color. And so pretty darn close to like a selective color, because I'm going to guess that this is when this photo was taken, those rocks probably came back solidly in the blue and cyan channels, which you can kind of see up at the top there. There's a little bit of magenta up there. And I'm going to, because shadow light, when it's recorded on a digital sensor, is recorded in the blue and cyan channels. So this looks like a photo where those channels were completely desaturated, and then the red and yellow channels were balanced to create this gold color in the light that was coming in through the entrance of this cave. Nothing wrong with that at all. I think it's a stunning, absolutely stunning effect here. And one of the things that's really interesting about this image's structure, right, is you have all of these jagged rocks forming this open area within the image, and then the light coming through it is coming through in these straight and smooth lines. So there's a nice interplay between the randomity and the jaggedness of these rocks, as well as the smoothness and of these golden rays of light. So really good approach to this subject. Really good eye for what a photo could be. What if I played around with these channels? What if I did it this way? And a really good instinct to desaturate the blue channel to emphasize that warm tone in the middle. So, and it looks also, by the way, like the green channel was pretty well desaturated, judging by some of the algae on the rocks here. But yeah, overall, really absolutely lovely effect. This image could not work as a black and white photo, and this is a really good use of color within the scene. Our next honorable mention comes from Luca Paesani, and this is a photo of a farm scene at the foot of a mountain, and a really nice use of soft focus here. Also of scale and distance. Like, there's a lot of depth in this photo. You've got the bales of the bales of hay, the rolls of hay kind of close up, and then this distant structure, and then the mountains behind it. And quite honestly, if it weren't for that structure, would this photo be successful? And we could have quite a lengthy debate about that, and I'm going to argue no, because that structure shows how big those mountains are. I mean, yeah, there's trees up there, but are they trees or are they bushes? Without that structure in the foreground, those could just be hills. So looking at this scene and saying, not only is this a pleasing use of color and repeated shape and tonal recession and things like that, which we'll hit on those in a couple of moments, it's a really good use of demonstrating scale in an image. So shape and color. We can talk about those pretty much at once, because in the bottom we have this big golden field. And the general shape of it goes to this mound, which kind of mirrors the structure of the two mountains behind it. but it's also a different color. So our eyes are really being drawn to this golden farm, golden hayfield in the foreground because it is so much of a different and brighter color than everything in the background. And then the shape of it leads into these two different mountains, and they exhibit a really strong degree of what's called tonal recession. So if you look at the left side, you've got those green trees that are a normal green color. And then if you go to the middle mountains, that middle mountain, the trees are a little bit more skewing cyan. And then in the background, they've taken on a distinctly bluer hue. And that's because of ultraviolet scattering and particulates in the air that cause colors to become more muted and skew toward the blue channel as they become more distant from us, as our eyes see this as well as our cameras. So that tonal recession, this and the scale, both do a really good job of contributing to the distance in this. And I think that, you know, imagine this photo if it was like sharp down to the stone on that building. Would it be as successful? I don't think so, because soft focus here is really creating an atmosphere for this photo and a mood, and it makes it feel very sort of, is this a landscape or did this photo come out of someone's dreams? So in all of those ways, this is a really pleasing and successful photo with a lot of really positive things going on inside of it. Our final honorable mention comes from Robert Thompson, and this is a landscape of a beach with silhouetted, primarily silhouetted people. As we've talked about throughout this video with lots of different things, the things that are going well here are really, really going well. The sky's interesting, great use of depth. I mean, look at the distant mountains behind what could be raw fog, could be rain, could just be UV scattering and particulate pollution. You've got the city back there. It's really far off because of how small those buildings are. And then in the foreground, you've got these people, right? And you can see from how small the people on the beach get, just how long a distance this beach is. We've got a lot of tracks from different vehicles going on the beach, which create this really interesting interplay of lines. The horizon is flat. It cuts right across the center of the image. So a lot of the elements that we've talked about in different photos throughout this video have really lined up beautifully here to create an image which is really pleasant to look at and really well structured. If there were anything to look at on this, over on the very left, you've got a tent cropped out. If you imagine going in with a cloning brush and turning that just into a little bit of beach with some water, that's the only element in here that I would say is standing out as a distracting element. So we'll go to our second place, our runner-up. And this comes from Antonio King. And this is a really, this is a calendar grade landscape, okay? And this is just so incredibly well executed. It's got dynamic lighting. The sun is in the scene, but the clouds have done a really good job of muting it and creating an even lighting throughout. It's got really dark tones in it as well. So there's the full gamut of tonal range within this photo. And then everything is super sharp. Like if you check out the foreground there, the foreground has the sand and the water, and you can see the detail in the sand, little flecks of sand reflecting light. And you can also see the detail in the trees on the rocks that are in the middle of the photo. And then you can get the detail in the clouds at the far, near the horizon line. Like just absolutely stunningly well executed landscape, really good use of texture because there's smoothness, there's jaggedness, tone as we talked about, and the overall composition with this big rock in the foreground is just, yeah, this is probably going to say this a third time in the next video about Antonio's photos, but this is one that I really kind of wish I had taken. This is an excellent, excellent execution. Which brings us to our winner, and this comes from Trevor Duff. And this is we did have a second photo that uses aspect ratio to amplify the scene. Like we talked about with the barn photo, this photo's doing that really well. And really loved this photo. Like I'm biased against waterfall photos. Always. I love photographing waterfalls. Probably one of my two favorite natural things in nature, in landscapes to photograph. So I'm always going to be drawn to a waterfall photo that's executed well. Here we have a waterfall that's been executed well. So the use here of black and white, or is it toned is it toned a little bit? I can't tell. But the black and white here really is a great choice for this photo, because stripping out all of the color data really amplifies the brightness of the running water coming over the waterfall and then coming away from the waterfall, and takes away any sort of distracting element that could be coming from the trees and the rock wall on the side of it. You know, it forces the waterfall to be the primary element because it's the brightest and lightest element. And that's also amplified by the fact that most of the very, very dark elements of the scene are right there next to and bleeding into the waterfall, which increases the contrast in the waterfall's smoothness, because there's some, very dark shadows behind it, which really amplifies the blurriness of the water and the waterfall. Like, this is absolutely stunningly well executed. And if I had taken this photo, I find it hard to believe that it would not have been in one of my 5 or 10 best photos of the year. This was absolutely this is the type of photo that if somebody said, what should a waterfall photo look like? I'd be like, here, this is what a waterfall photo should look like. So well done. Thank you everybody for watching through this whole video. We'll see you tomorrow in the portrait evaluation.